Hello, welcome. I love how Trackmania has gotten more popular with the console release. So many new players are experiencing and having fun playing with the game. However, that also means a lot of new players are building maps for the first time. I'm not hating, we all start somewhere, including myself, but I'm noticing a lot of the same mistakes that these new players keep building. So I'm going to go over 5 of the most common beginner mapping mistakes, why they're bad, and how to fix them. It's not in any order in terms of importance, it's just a list, not a ranking. But before we get started, there is something important I should go over. Context is very important when keeping these rules in mind. I'm saying these things with the assumption that you, the viewer, are building with mass appeal in mind. So for things such as Track of the Day, your map has to be well received by most people coming across it. If that's not your goal, and instead you have a very specific audience in mind, then it's fine to ignore these. I would still argue it's important to at least be aware of these pitfalls, however. That way, if you do decide to add these elements into your track, it's a conscious decision. Okay, let's get started. I do have an honorable mention, and it's the standstill GPS trigger. This is an honorable mention because it doesn't apply to just new mappers. The GPS is a very common include for maps looking to become track of the day. It's a replay of the map being driven, showing the lines, and how to drive the map in general. Unfortunately, only PC players have access to the media tracker to make a GPS as of me recording this, so if you're a console builder, don't worry about it. The most popular tutorial that shows how to make a GPS shows you how to make a standstill GPS. No shade towards Flink. He also mentions how to make one where you drive into the trigger, but people generally dislike standstill GPS triggers since they can be kind of annoying. If you want to watch the GPS, you have to wait a few seconds instead of being able to drive directly into the trigger. And if you want to view the map in Cam 7 and have a look around, you have to drive a little bit and then do it. It sounds like a very small complaint, which is why this is an honorable mention instead of an actual item in the list, but it's one of those quality of life aspects to a map that can rub people the wrong way. Just change the GPS to trigger when you drive into something and everything is all good. Now that I've gotten that off my chest, on to the list itself. I've touched on this in a previous video, and here it is again. I don't know what it is about those straight, long road sections, but I see them all the time in beginner maps. I think it comes from a place where, as a beginner, you're excited to be driving your map, you're looking forward to certain elements, how some things turned out, and you don't really notice that the beginning is just 10 straight seconds of press forwards. For someone coming across the map for the first time, the beginning is boring and incredibly tedious to drive every time. Even in the middle of the map, it's easy to leave too much space between elements. This can break the flow a bit and punish players who made a small mistake in the previous element, as now everyone is faster than them and there is nothing they can do about it. Basically, long straight sections are boring and they feel bad. They're good when used to let the player set up for the next element, but overstay their welcome very quickly. The simple solution is to shorten these sections, but before you do, think about why they're there in the first place. If it's in the beginning, you're probably trying to get the player up to a certain speed or gear. Instead of letting the car gradually gain speed over a long straight, try placing a booster or two. Now, the player can get right to the fun part. If it's in between elements, test how much room you actually need to set up. If you feel like you need all that room and players are still saying it's boring, you can add an obstacle or two to dodge to keep the driver engaged. If you do go this route, don't place obstacles directly in the best line through the section. They should keep the player engaged without shoving them off course. The entire point of playing Trackmania is to have fun, so don't keep the audience waiting. Speaking of keeping the audience waiting, it's not that hard to think of why large jumps keep getting added to new players' maps. When you're starting out, jumps are cool and exciting, and the larger the jump is, the better. However, that excitement tends to fade pretty quickly. Going back to the last section, there's not really much a player can do in the air. Even if they have a reactor boost, the player is mostly just waiting to reach the next section already. I put a large jump in my Track of the Day Lakeside, and it was one of the most common complaints. There are a couple other reasons why jumps aren't looked at fondly. It's incredibly common for someone to put this massive jump across the entire arena and then have a single road strip be the entire landing area. Unless you're building a trial map, players won't enjoy trying to thread the car through the eye of a needle just to finish. Speaking of that landing, the larger the jump, the harder it is to build a smooth landing. The more time spent in the air, the more time there is for variance, and you either have to dedicate a huge section to try to corral everyone back on track, or have the car crash back onto the road somehow. Neither option is great, and most players eventually realize it's a bigger hassle than it's worth. If you do really want to put in a large jump, such as what I did on Lakeside, here's what I recommend. Have the setup to the jump and the jump itself be straight to give the players ample time to align themselves. If the players are jumping at a diagonal, that's going to make the landing that much harder, and it'll be very easy to flip the car on impact. Consider a reactor boost to smooth out the trajectory and landing, but beware of those cuts and zoops. Only have one large to medium sized jump. As previously stated, it's very similar to a straight line where the player isn't doing much of anything. You might be able to get away with one section like that, but definitely not two or more. Remember, players want to play the game and get annoyed by what essentially is a loading screen in the middle of the map. Unfortunately, landings aren't the only part of the map that can be rough. Transitions are tough to build, even for more experienced mappers. When starting out, it's difficult to tell the difference between a harder map and an awkward one, and this carries over to transitions. As a general rule, there should be an intuitive way to take the transition smoothly. And no, going from a downward ramp straight into a flat platform isn't a good element. The more unstable the transition is, the more vulnerable you become to random slowdowns and landing bugs. If there's enough of a risk, grinding for a good time on your map can feel like a slot machine instead of a test of skill. Players will try to avoid airtime, so a transition shouldn't send the car flying in order to properly take it. I'm still not that great at transitions, but there are plenty of examples of maps that do them extremely well. If you want to include some skillful transitions, look at what those maps are doing and take those. It's rare for a map to include a transition that hasn't been seen before, so as long as you aren't taking the turns leading up to the transition and other elements around, it should be fine to copy a couple blocks. If you send the map into the map review server, pay attention if other players are constantly crashing or taking the transitions incorrectly. Oftentimes, it's because the proper way isn't clear, and you'll have to do something to help them along, whether it's signs or a strategic pole placement. Transitions are tough. Don't be afraid to take inspiration from other maps and double check that the correct way to take them is clear and smooth. Gears aren't obvious upon first playing the game. To help you along, players have made several videos that go in depth on how they work and why they're important. But to briefly go over how they work, the car in Trackmania is automatic. Gears will either go up or down on their own depending if you're speeding up or slowing down past a certain speed barrier. Shifting gears takes just a second, but the car doesn't accelerate during that time. That's why you'll hear other players complain about dropping a gear when they could have kept it. Not only are they now at a lower speed, they'll lose more speed as they now have to spend time gearing back up instead of accelerating. It sounds insignificant on paper, but losing a gear on a 45-second map can cost almost a full second by the finish line. Now, a common response to someone complaining about dropped gears is skill issue. But if it's really easy to accidentally switch gears on your map, it puts the player in a really weird spot. Now they have to either risk the time loss or take a suboptimal line to avoid it entirely. This isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but you do have to be careful, and it's important to figure out if this is a good difficulty spike or something that turns out to be incredibly annoying. The other problem with gears is taking them cleanly. If the car is sliding while it attempts to gear up or down, the transition takes a bit longer. Once again, that seems insignificant, but it turns out to be a big deal over the course of an entire route. Mappers are expected to keep in mind where the players are most likely to gear up/down and leave room for the change. In beginner maps, it's very common to have the car attempt a gear up in the middle of a grass turn. This can cause the car to first gear up, but then immediately gear back down due to the speed loss, only for the car to want to gear back up soon after. If one gear change can cause a time loss of nearly a second, 3 in short succession is a nightmare. This is where you might hear players talk about a map being uncalculated. This is why it's important to test a variety of lines and approaches to double check that it's not too easy to accidentally change gears. Your players will appreciate the courtesy. Now, I know I said that the list wasn't in order, and that's mostly true, but I saved the most important for last. Gears are important, but they're a niche in a broader topic about speed control. This is the biggest problem I encounter by far. When playing people's first maps, it's extremely common for me to go flying off the track for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's a small hill that sends the car flying over the checkpoint directly behind it. Other times the car turns out to be way too fast for a certain element. Specifically, I have no idea why this keeps popping up, but stop building red boosters into an immediate hairpin turn. Why do people keep building this? I don't know. I guess they're trying to kill the driver or something. I don't get it. But anyway, the common theme is that the car is going too fast for the obstacles built into the map. I think this happens for a couple reasons. The first is that since the builder is new to the game, they're still understanding how things work on a physical level. This means that they don't quite understand just how far the car will go off of that small jump, or what is intuitive to players who haven't played the map before. They're still getting better at driving as well, so it's not difficult for someone with more experience to naturally drive the route faster. Even if the builder calculated the map for their speed, other players might still be faster. Once again, I would like to stress that this isn't a dig or insult. I'm not calling anyone trash, it's just how skill progression works. The game wouldn't be very exciting if you started playing and already racking up world records within a week. To fix this, pay attention to how people are driving your map the first few times. Instead of driving your own map in map review, spectate other players and see if they're crashing elements because of their speed. Also, playtest your own map. If you have to hold the brake down for a full few seconds just to be able to make a turn, it might be time to rethink that corner. The other facet to why I think this is happening is the social/meta side of things. Trackmania has a meta to mapping, and Track of the Day is a great example. Every once in a while, I'll see someone justify their lack of speed control by offsetting that responsibility to the player. They might type into the chat responding to criticism saying, well, you don't always have to go that fast, or just slow down. This is true on the surface. It can seem like one of those defenses that feels wrong when looking at it, but it's difficult to explain why. This is where the track meta comes into play. On one hand, trying to go as fast as possible on a map that doesn't focus on speed could be exciting as you're trying to push the limit while constantly risking flying off the track. On the other hand, anyone who has actually played this style of map will tell you that it's incredibly infuriating and unfun being punished for gaining speed. Sure, you can build a map where the player is constantly having to slow down to avoid certain doom, just like the player is free to go play a map where that isn't a core feature. To make a note here, I'm not talking about every map that requires pressing the brake or releasing gas. I'm more talking about the examples I noted above where you have way too much speed heading into a hairpin turn, or you go off a large jump only to find that the next checkpoint is now several cart lengths below you. Tech has always been a beloved genre despite Nadeo's best efforts, and where tech rewards the player by seeing how fast they can make tight corners, these maps let the car gain a bunch of speed right before punishing them for that speed. It's just not a fun map to play, and you're better off avoiding this if you're looking for that mass appeal. Instead, I would take that idea of requiring the player to slow down and look towards building either Tech or NASCAR. Tech is a map style revolving around tight corners and challenges the player to take them as fast as possible by drifting. NASCAR is somewhat similar, but instead of drifting, the map has wider turns, so releasing the gas for a moment is faster. Both of these styles are much more widely accepted, and players will generally like them a lot more. I could honestly go a lot longer about speed control and why it's important, so I did in one of my previous videos. I go over when, why, and how to control the speed of the player, so if you feel like you need additional help, I would recommend giving that a watch. Otherwise, just remember that a lot of the excitement of Trackmania is to see how fast you can go while maintaining control, and punishments are not very fun. And that wraps up what are 5 of the most common mistakes I see on the map review server, plus an honorable mention. If you found that you were making some of these mistakes, don't worry. Everyone started off by making these awkward, uncalculated maps. My hope is that you guys learned something and you can use this information to improve your future maps. I like driving good tracks, and I look forward to seeing your creations in map review. If you did end up learning something today, why not like the video? You can also subscribe for more mapping tips. If you feel like I missed anything or have stories about your first few maps, be sure to share them down below. I read every comment, so I'll be answering any questions as well. I hope to see you in my next video, but until then, don't forget to put a giant jump scare at the end of your GPS. Bye!